Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for joining me for it. And thank you especially to the people who make this possible for you with their support at patreon.com/SW7x7. So we're in the middle of a rewatch of The Acolyte. Yeah, it seems like it's maybe too soon, but maybe not, in that the whole season is fresh in our minds. And so now as we rewatch the episodes, we can get connections between the episodes that we weren't necessarily able to make before. So that's what we're doing, and today we're talking about Day, which is episode 4 of season 1. For a start, let's talk about the idea of possession. So when we start this episode, we're in Kelnaka's crashed ship home on Kofar, and we see all of the designs on the wall, right? The ones like on the tattoo on Mae's head from the Ascension ceremony. And it's a little odd, right? Like, why does he have all of these things going on? Well, it might have to do with the fact that, as we learn in episode 7, that he was possessed by the witches of Brendok, like Master Torben had been when he was a Padawan. And you know, Torben, in the final analysis, didn't necessarily do anything bad in those moments, right? Like, he wasn't the one to kill any of the Brendok witches, and he was just defending himself against Kelnaka when Kelnaka got possessed. But Torben certainly suffered a lot of negative effects from the situation. Like, he was freaking out in that episode when we see what really happened, right, the story, and he ended up taking the Barash vow and cutting himself off and trying to find peace with what happened. But you could also go so far as to say that he was trying to find peace from the effects of the possession that he underwent. And maybe it's the same with Kelnaka. And we also have to take into account the situation that happens with Kymir and Osha. When Osha puts on the helmet and she starts getting taken over by it, and Kymir has that happen to his eyes, right? The blackness in his eyes as well. That seems to suggest that there's something that connects Kymir to the witches of Brendok. And then, as we were talking about on yesterday's episode, maybe Darth Plagueis also connected to the witches of Brendok. So maybe it was a situation where Plagueis showed up with Kymir and they possessed Kymir like they did with Torben. And in the next episode, we're going to hear Yord talking about how Kymir seems to get in his head and stay there. And that would also suggest that maybe Kymir was part of the witches of Brendok at some point. Maybe that's where Plagueis picked him up as a survivor for wherever the witches were chased out of. And since we're talking about Kymir, let's talk a little bit more about him and just the act that he puts on throughout this whole season until he is revealed. So the goofiness and the clumsiness that he exhibits is very excellently done, and that was a whole part of the planning of things, that he was supposed to seem like this innocent and useless character and ultimately be so terrifying. But now that we see who he is, we see the needling that he's been doing of Mae in a different light, right? The fact that he tells her, yeah, you keep failing so far, and talking about Osha seeming that she's over her head, but certainly seeming like she is fond of that Jedi Master. Oh, what's his name? Saul, right? Yeah, like the playing dumb is really cute. But he's also trying to pep talk Mae too when she sits down and says it's impossible, you can't kill a Jedi with a weapon, they won't attack a defenseless person, so how is this possible? And he tells her that it's not impossible, it's okay, you can do it, I'll get you some water, it's gonna be okay. But interestingly, he hasn't said, hey, you force choke him, right? Like, he hasn't given her the clue. And it's interesting that it's a lesson she must teach herself. That means that apparently, for whatever reason, she's going to have to be the one to discover that force choking is an option here. And the parallels between Kymir and Saul in this episode are particularly interesting because Yord suggests to Osha that Osha may be there not just to deal with Mae, but also to deal with Osha's own problems and situations and fears and regrets and resentments. It's Yord who suggests that first, and then later on, it's Saul who suggests that to Osha, and then also says, when this is all over, I'm going to explain everything. So he's at the point where he's finally going to come clean about what happened on Brendock all those years ago. But the big problem for Saul is that the truth is now officially going to come out about what happened on Brendock all those years ago, because the fact that Mae is still alive and the fact that he is going to try to arrest her and do it while bringing her in, the truth is going to come out because Mae was a witness to the truth. And I suppose in this particular sense, it speaks well of Saul that he's not going to try to see Mae killed to keep the secret, right? Like, he could have let Holden and the other Jedi go and get her and let the chips fall where they may. And he basically makes the decision that he has to tell Osha what the deal is before Mae is able to reveal what the deal is, because it'll be worse if it happens that way, which is, of course, the truth. And you think about that, if Saul had been the one to tell Osha if they had captured Mae and gotten off of Kofar safely, then Osha certainly would have been angry to the point of absolute desolation, but she would not necessarily have walked down the path to the dark side of the Force and would have just ultimately left the Jedi behind and been utterly disillusioned by them, and that would have been the end of it. So yeah, kudos to Saul for deciding that he was going to try to bring Mae in alive even when seeing her dead would have possibly protected the secret, and for the fact that he was trying to work to convince Osha that there was still good in her even when Osha was utterly convinced that that was not the case. And the conflict within Osha around seeing Mae alive but still feeling resentment for everything that she believed Mae did, some of which is accurate and some of which is not, all of that was still there. And she does admit to Yord, basically, that when we saw her fire the stun blast in episode 2, that she hesitated. She pulled the shot. It does say that also in the audio description as well, but now she actually openly admits it to Yord, basically. And speaking of that, it's kind of interesting that Yord in the beginning of the episode says, hey, you got that blaster, give it up. It's the property of the Jedi Order, and she doesn't give it up. And later in episode 5, there's that moment where Yord is on the ground and the stranger's coming at him. She uses that blaster to distract the stranger / Darth Chimere, and Darth Chimere starts chasing her. So her keeping that blaster actually saves Yord for a little while at least. And also the last thing I'll flag is that as I've been tracking the idea of seeing Osha wake up in 3 episodes in a row, doesn't happen in this episode. So the moment I flagged it, then the streak was broken immediately in episode 4. However, she does get knocked out at the end of this episode, and so she'll be waking up at the beginning of episode 5. And that's what I've got for you on our rewatch episode related to Day. That's episode 4 of season 1 of The Acolyte, and that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please help me help more people find it and add it to their listening joy. You can do that by just telling people that this exists. You can do that by telling algorithms with ratings and reviews and likes and comments and follows and joins and subscribes. And you can even help me produce this daily dose of Star Wars joy. And you can learn more about that at patreon.com/SW7x7. And it just remains for me to say, thank you so much for joining me for this episode as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.